And that doesn't necessarily mean we have to stop chatting, just so you know
Yeah.
we're live. And it is recording, just so you know. So we'll have this for posterity.
Well, the conversation Shadid and I had last week was so good that it felt like we should just record this and, just show that to folks.
Yeah. Yeah, right. That's true. Sometimes the informal ones tend to be more. I was watching one from Massachusetts DEP put on something similar, much more specific to operations and access really to, multicultural families and complexes and diverse language speakers. It was really great because it showed a lot of custom designed media, utilizing, for example, pictures of, if you engage in a community, for example, and you would probably see this more in Atlanta or Portland, we don't have that much in Burlington, although we do have considerable Vietnamese and Bosnian communities in some various African countries. But then specifying not only their language, but trying to identify the products they use and making posters specific to that, and then getting a conduit to get that information out there. And it's so great because a lot of times, even in my experience, I'll just specifically translate whatever English marketing materials I've done, and it doesn't always translate the same. Very often it does not translate the same at all. And just doing that alone can have a really good hit rate in terms of getting some of that ROI. But you have to have the resources and the time to be able to do that. But it was a pretty good session.
Absolutely. I mean, those are the things we were like. This is so broad that you can, like you said, we can have volumes of discussion, kind of looking at it from different angles. And so had to even kind of dial it back. I was like, oh, we can't even go down these roads. We have to kind of look at what tools can we provide for colleges and universities and other community partners that they can come home and utilize,
Yeah, definitely.
See, it might just be a nice discussion between us. It's not bad.
Yeah. Well, I do know, as I mentioned, there was oh no, it looks like we have 69 participants. Sorry if I was seeing that wrong. Okay, we're here. Great. All right, we're gonna leave. So we do have some folks here, which is wonderful. Sorry, we're just chit-chatting away. I'll wait another minute or two for folks to get in here before we get going. But what I am going to do is share my screen for a moment here. 1 second. Okay, can everybody see that?
No.
No, you can't see that. I'm not sharing my screen here. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Now you can see that. Great. Okay, wonderful. All right. What time? So I think we're gonna get going. It's 3 minutes after. We have a big discussion today ahead of us. We have about 75 people here. So you can see us and you can hear us, which is wonderful. So the technology is working. And thank you all very much for joining today. It is this is December 21st, so it's the right day. It's 2 p.m. So for folks who maybe had this at 1 p.m., I apologize. There was a bit of a challenge with the timing. But again, we have a good number of folks here today, which is great. My name is Corey Berman. I am at the University of Vermont. I'm the Zero Waste Program Manager, and you are here at CURC's last webinar of 2023, which is wonderful. Thank you so much for joining. As a few folks have done, we already encourage you to drop your name in the chat, drop your institution in the chat, let us know where you're joining us today from. It's wonderful to connect with people, so feel free to do that throughout the webinar. As I mentioned, my name is Corey Berman. I'm the Zero Waste Program Manager at the University of Vermont and a member of CURC's Marketing and Programs Committee. CURC is the College and University Recycling Coalition, and we are a member-based organization that works to grow collegiate recycling and waste reduction efforts by fostering information sharing, best practices, educational support, and networking opportunities between staff, faculty, and student leaders, all of which are doing various things to implement reduction, diversion, and minimization programs across their campuses. As it says here on the screen, today's presentation will cover justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in zero waste. This is part of our free CURC webinar series. They run every other month. And these go back really to about 2010. So we've been doing this for a really long time. And these various webinars, they highlight everything on campuses, including innovative trends, perspectives, and broad range of operational and educational topics. I have a few housekeeping notes to go over really quick. You've probably all been on webinars before, so you know the drill. If you have problems with your audio and video during this webinar, you can visit Zoom's support center by visiting support.zoom.us. To avoid background noise, we've placed all but our panelists' lines on mute. We encourage you to submit questions at any time by using the Q&A section. You can also feel free to chat and submit questions there if you like, whatever's easiest for you, and feel free to, I think, raise your hands once the folks are done chatting and open it up for Q&A as well. We'll get to as many of these as possible. For general comments and notes, again, please use the chat function at the dashboard. Copies of today's presentation slides will be available to download, and the full recording will eventually be available to stream at the CURC website, which is www.curc3r.org. Again, that's curc3r.org. Okay. So as it said in the original introduction to this, for years, the environmental movement has long ignored or failed to address issues of systemic racism, justice, diversity, and equity within the world of recycling and waste management. Inequities in the system are embedded in our society and throughout our history. CURC recognizes that addressing these issues is necessary to foster a world that is both socially and environmentally just, empowers individuals and groups, and promotes economic equality while preserving resources and biodiversity through efficient resource management. Attendees of the program today will hear ways of operationalizing equity and inclusion in the recycling field and learning how your organization can integrate justice, equity, and best practices into your recycling programs. This is a very important topic, as we all know, and we could spend hours and hours discussing it. Unfortunately, we only have the 1 hour today. But as always, we encourage you to continue the conversation by utilizing the CURC listserv. Many folks are already on that listserv, but if not, we'll drop a link into the chat where you can sign up. Again, that's the CURC listserv, so please sign up for that. I'm going to do a quick introduction of both our speakers, and then we'll get to it. Our guests today are Shadid Abdul Salam. He's worked as an educator, public health scientist, and consultant for roughly 2 decades. He has training in biology, chemistry, and public health, and attended Morehouse College and Emory's Rollins School of Public Health. He has made an indelible impact in the environmental and public health sector through impactful research projects at several universities and institutions, such as Princeton, UC Davis, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Through his work, Shadid has brought science-based programming to amplify learning hubs for local municipalities in the Atlanta area and around the world. He's spoken at multiple forums as a subject matter expert, securing funding and technical assistance, increasing community awareness around sustainability, social determinants of health and public health, and he specializes in bringing sustainability-based funding, grants, and major partnerships to spawn innovative and commercialization in scientific practice. Shadid's major passion is developing communities by exposing underserved populations to solutions by connecting with people. And he has served as National Vice President of Morehouse College's Alumni Association, has been featured in various publications as a scientist, educator, and community leader. And he currently serves as the director for Morehouse's Center for Sustainability and Innovation. Elizabeth Chin Start is with us today. She's the founder of Start Consulting Group. Her career has spanned work in the circular economy for over 20 years with a focus on materials management and reuse. This work has spanned local government, private industry, nonprofit, and consulting. Elizabeth founded Start Consulting Group to ensure inclusion, equity, and justice are ingrained in the circular economy. She builds relationships through trust, communication, and empowerment to develop and create strong organizational cultures. Elizabeth is also a reused artist and magpie who uses any shiny discarded object she can find. So again, welcome Shadid and Elizabeth. Really appreciate you being here. And Shadid, I will turn it over to you to begin.
Thank you so much, Corey. So first and foremost, it's a pleasure to be here speaking with you all today. The cool part is technology has it so that we can kind of engage from all over the country and talk about have meaningful discussions like this. One thing that I failed to mention, is that I'm also on the board of CURC, which has been it's been a wonderful experience thus far, as we're looking to actualize and scale up solutions and tools for colleges and universities in the recycling space. So first and foremost, I want to kind of dive into the topic. It's huge. It's a huge topic. And I'm kind of going to take this from a more so of an informal approach in some ways. We are hearing, we hear about JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. All of these things, a lot of times when we reflect on these words in our history, it's people just look at it as black and white, which that is not what we want this lens and this perspective in the way that we're looking at this. This topic, specifically around university recycling, and we will engage in some of those things, systemic, issues from environmental justice and other areas. But when we look at this, we want to make sure that communities are able to last into the future so that they can thrive and live. And the purpose for this work is to ensure that everyone has a seat at the table, and not just a seat at the table, but a voice at the table. Everybody's viewpoint is respected. Everybody's perspective is valued. And so when you hear these words, what I want us to kind of even set the framework of is really looking at it as we need to have a mosaic-based team that can look at solving problems differently. I was just doing some light research, and I gave a presentation a few months back to some of my student interns, and it was referencing an article from Harvard Business Review on why diverse teams are smarter, right? And one key piece is you have groups of people who can look at solving problems in a different way. And so I think that it's critical when we're talking about people with different perspectives. They bring different viewpoints and different solutions. And I think that's what's needed in this work. And I'm gonna just go over a couple little things, and then I'm gonna actually pass it off to Elizabeth, because I want her to get into the slides and some of these tools that her and I spoke about. And the goal is what tools can we use to take home? So colleges and universities are the anchors of most communities that we come from. They tend to have the largest population pool or nexus where they're draining the resources on the collective area. They also are the space where the collective brain trusts are looked at to gain guidance and enlighten them as they are projecting us into the future. So they serve as huge producers of waste, right? But also centers of enlightenment. So I want us to kind of keep a good glimpse of that framework, right? Because it shows this is an opportunity for us in terms of what we're looking to do, right? Of course, this thing is, like I've framed diversity, equity, inclusion, right? How can we get this diverse viewpoint for people to help solve these problems? And there are other key areas where we're seeing a high population where there's a lack of inclusion, right? Specifically, I represent Morehouse College, which is a historically Black college and university. I'm not sure if I'm the first board member of CURC from an HBCU, but historically Black colleges and universities are mainly set in communities that have long time dealt with being misaligned, and usually high levels of neglect and lack of funding and lack of resources. So one goal we're going to come up with is coming together with some ideas on how we can help impact and have other large colleges and universities partner back with communities that have high needs. I want to let Elizabeth roll through the slides that she has, and then there's some materials, some questions, and then we're going to kind of engage, and we want to field some questions at that point. So I'm going to go ahead and let you pass that to you quickly, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Shadid. I'm honored to be here as well, and honored to get to be having this conversation with Shadid. We got to meet last week, and it was just such a beautiful, robust conversation about just the need for Jedi and, equity and justice in just our field in general, with recycling, whether in colleges or in our communities. So it's really important. So a lot of what I hear in my work is, how do you actually implement equity and justice into our systems? And there's a disconnect there. There are folks who, I had someone who, not to categorize engineers, but it was an engineer who said, "Is there a checklist that I can use to help me, um, you know, what to do and how to implement this?" And it's such a challenge for folks. I think a lot of us are attending workshops, we're doing the work, we're reading articles, being part of allied groups, all the good stuff, learning and stuff. Um, but then there's a disconnect. Like, now what do I do? How do I actually take this learning, and apply it to the work that I'm doing? And so that's why I'm hoping to kind of give you some quick tools. And then I also sent Corey some worksheets that hopefully can help you all, and he'll either send it out, or I'll have my email at the end too, that I'm happy to send you some worksheets that hopefully can help you kind of navigate this. So this is high level. This is usually a 2-hour workshop, so I've condensed it down. But it's broken up. I have it broken up into two different categories: internal strategies and external. You have to, like, clean your own house before you go tell somebody else how to clean theirs. So just some really good internal strategies, whatever your department looks like, is understanding, like, if you have folks coming in who, are from BIPOC communities or other socioeconomic statuses, just being culturally competent, recognizing, like, yours is not the only experience. Being trauma informed, practicing compassion with folks, really understanding, like, folks have, seen a lot of harm, and especially, with communities of color, and Black, Indigenous communities, faced a lot of harm. And when they're coming into predominantly white spaces, um, there's a lot of trauma that's there to unpack. And that's a much bigger conversation, probably a different webinar. But just, creating that inclusive space for folks, using inclusive language, especially when we're talking about genders, or even when we're referring to folks, just using kindness in our language as well. Additionally, with bringing in equity and justice into your work and really operationalizing it, is finding allies. You can't go this work alone. This is, it's really deep work that has to be done. And it can be intense at times. So having allies is really important. Being patient. This work doesn't happen overnight. It took us many, many centuries to get to this point where we're facing all these injustices. And so it's not going to be changed overnight. Setting aside your own self-interest. Sometimes that's easier said than done. Especially when you're working with folks who have not had the same opportunities as you. And then just being an advocate. So those are just some high-level internal strategies to kind of help you as you're looking at inwardly into your department, or even just your school in general. And then I also hear from folks is, like, we have a team that's really supportive of this work, but we really struggle with getting our leadership to change. And so these are some, things, if you're a leader of a program, or if you're trying to communicate with the leaders or budget managers, is to really, help them understand, like, folks need time and budget to be able to do equity and justice work properly. Again, we're not going to have change if we're just, having people, saying, "Hey, we want the system to be equitable. We want our college campus recycling to be an equitable and accessible system," but do that on top of your existing work. So understanding, like, time and budget is a need. Leaders need to be mentoring or finding and seeking mentors that can help folks with equity and justice. Listening to employees, creating action steps. Um, Having, leaders need to support training resources, access for folks. And, lastly, for leaders, is recognizing where you need to improve. And I think that's sometimes easier said than done for leaders, because you have so many things on your plate if you're a leader, or if you work with a leader, that it's hard to find those spots and listen into, folks, and listen to what the real needs are, and understanding where folks are. So the next part is, understanding, oh, I have a different slide. Sorry, yeah. One tool that can be used is, it's called power mapping. And really, and when Shadida and I were talking last week, was really looking at, like, historical perspectives of this work, of how we got to where we are. We can't solve issues if we can't name them. We need to understand who has the power, who has the influence in our systems. You have to understand who's impacted by our systems. You know, if you're implementing a recycling system, you know, so in Oregon, for example, we have what's called a bottle bill. So there's a 10 cents that comes back with cans and bottles. And if you implement a system to collect those, you know, you may be taken away from maybe a student who has, you know, comes from a low income background who is collecting those cans to get extra money. So, you know, thinking about impacts of all the programs that we implement, understanding who's not included, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And again, understanding who our allies are in this work and our detractors. If you're trying to bring up the conversation of equity and justice, you know, you've inevitably heard somebody who doesn't understand it, they're scared, they don't like change, and they're going to be a detractor against it and come up with all the reasons why we don't need equitable and just systems. So here's an example. And again, I have some worksheets available that Corey can send out. So, you know, when you're power mapping, it's kind of like a SWOT analysis in a way. So understanding who has the most influence, who has the least influence, who's on board with what you're doing, who's opposed to it. And so I have an example, and this is for like internal programs. I'm many years removed from being in college, so might have some of the names wrong, but here's some examples. So, for example, your department head or your budget manager, you know, your department head might be, you know, wanting to support it, but they definitely have the most influence. You have passionate employees who very strongly support the work, but they don't have a lot of influence. And so, how do you understand who those folks are and work with them? You also might have a grumpy coworker who, you know, says that, you know, everybody's the same, you know, or use the phrase all lives matter, and be that person who's really detracting from trying to create equitable and just systems. So by actually mapping that out and understanding that, that really will help you determine how to operationalize in your programs at your schools. I think we're mostly talking to university folks, how to implement those recycling systems. And so now we'll talk about external strategies. So this is mainly, you know, in thinking about your student populations that are coming in, or your workforce, or other folks who are, you know, coming to campus. You know, understanding like putting people first is always the best strategy. You know, thinking about what your students' needs are. You know, you have to build trust and long-term relationships. I know in a college setting, you have students for 4 years, or, you know, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, but, you know, just really building that trust. But that also goes towards, you know, building long-term relationships with other folks who are part of the work that you're doing in our recycling systems. Listening to the needs and wants of students, being culturally relevant. And, you know, this one's important because you have students coming from all walks of life, you know, all different cultural backgrounds, different socioeconomic statuses. You know, I did not have access to recycling systems growing up. It wasn't really until I landed in this industry that I started recycling, because, you know, it wasn't just part, you know, growing up in low income multifamily homes, never having access, understanding that. But then too, you know, also culturally, there were a lot of things we were doing to reuse a lot. We were living pretty sustainably. We just didn't have the same language. So understanding that folks are doing this work and they're probably doing a great job. And so honoring what they're already doing and figuring out how that can work in tandem with your existing recycling and reuse systems that you have. Simplifying your language, you know, for students, you have students who come from different understandings. Using industry jargon doesn't help anyone. So understanding, you know, if you simplify language, it can meet a broad set of needs. It also helps you, you know, something Corey had mentioned earlier is like transcreation, is that, you know, just simply translating something is not enough. But if you have simplified language, it helps creating any kind of information you want to give to your students or other populations in their languages, makes creating that easier for them to understand. And then also holding yourself accountable and your organization as well. And I think that's sometimes the hardest part. You know, sometimes we, you know, as you know, the recycling industry think, oh, I have this great program I'm going to implement, without really consulting folks and, you know, making missteps along the way, and just holding ourselves accountable and making sure that throughout, you know, the whole process, especially of implementing programs, that we're listening to folks and bringing folks to the table to talk about it. So I have dorm recycling example of power mapping, how this could work, again, many years removed from being in this setting. But, if you're implementing, dorm room recycling, understanding who has the most influence, but then also too, this is, I have least access, most access, like how convenient is it to recycle in dorm rooms? Our students, do they have, recycling in the dorms? Do they have to walk to a recycling container dumpster? And thinking about how folks can access your systems. So again, this is just a very quick example of, what power mapping could look like, understanding when you're implementing these systems that there's so many folks who are involved, and we just have to name it to really be able to understand and make an impact on folks and make a difference. Uh, so here's my email. Feel free to email me if you have any questions or want to talk more kind of about these quick tools that I went over. And again, there's some corresponding worksheets that Corey will send along with the slides too, that hopefully can kind of help you map out your systems and operationalizing that. So I'm going to stop sharing and looking forward to getting to chat more.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Shadid. Appreciate you both going over that at first. I think something that resonated with me was when you said be patient, which is tough in this challenging time of climate change and wanting to solve problems of environmental justice. And it's, we all hear the sort of the death knell of climate change in all these news reports, yet at the same time we need to learn how to be patient, because otherwise we'll probably burn out. So it's a sometimes those countermanding directives can be challenging to navigate, for sure. And then I think one thing I would ask is how would you recommend, and this is a question for both of you, how would we recommend we build trust quickly? Because as you mentioned, these students, although you mentioned some of them stay longer, in my experience, they tend to leave earlier because very often they're either moving off campus. If a lot of us work with our direct populations who live on campus, they're moving off campus, they're traveling abroad, they're transferring out of school, then maybe they're dropping out. Do you have any tips, either of you, to kind of build trust quickly with students or even faculty or staff to help facilitate some of this work?
I can speak to that, and I'll let Elizabeth jump on it. One thing that I can say would be you really have to get involved in student organizations. When it comes down to our student activities and housing and other activities, they have to see that you execute on what you say, right? And a part of it is I wanted to kind of get into the story of even what we had to do at Morehouse. But, if you are recycling, if you're doing single stream, you have to ensure that students can see the feature and the benefit, right? They have to see the benefit of less waste being produced and a lot of times pushed in communities that are underserved and underdeveloped and impacted, right? And they have to really, they have to be able to feel it. And I think that's the statement that you're making is almost tying to why we have to almost educate around the environmental justice piece. So they can see the story, right? What's happening when a community is being developed, right? And how does it impact the people? And so I think that the sooner you get them involved, from hands-on activity to hearing about it, to being able to kind of feel and touch and possibly go to a MRF or go to do a recycling and a cleanup effort, are like Elizabeth and I'm sure we're going to talk about it shortly, in terms of that dorm power mapping, what happens at the end of the semesters, in the end of the school year, right? And what happens to these things instead of just throwing them into dumpsters. So I think getting the students involved, but then also from a leadership standpoint, when she was doing that power mapping, looking at some of the stakeholders, the key stakeholders at the colleges and universities in particular, and letting them know just the major benefit that they will be having it to reduce, GHG and other things that are impacting the college's bottom line. So that's my quick thoughts.
That's great. And 100% agree. And I think, yeah, going to where the students are, but being authentic too. I think, you're working with young folks. I have a teenager, so I know that, young folks who are a couple years removed from teenagehood, but, or, young adult, or they're getting into young adulthood. So being authentic and developing those relationships too, I think is so important. And, I think too, and, especially, using the tools that, engages young folks, and finding too some of those, professors or teachers or staff who are really good at engaging younger folks, or your student population as well, I think is will go a long way. And don't come at it as like, oh, like I want you to recycle, like you want something from them too. I think just as humans in general, when somebody gives us that approach, we're not as interested. And then I think too, it's working with them, but it's like, how do you simplify our systems to make it as easy and user friendly as possible, but also too with young folks, like a gamification aspect of it, like
Mhm.
is there's like, look at what we did, recycling, we as campus recycled this much, all of those things. But yeah, just being authentic in those relationships.
Great. Thank you. Yeah,
Can
go
I,
for it. Jude.
can I jump in on? I see Tara Gallagher responded in the chat, and I wanted to address that, which I thought was very cool. We're in a major age of thrifting, upcycling, swap shops, um, and what her question was is about their free cycle tables and thrifting and other opportunities there on campus. We have been I've had discussions probably over about the past 2 years with students at in the Atlanta University Center, specifically Morehouse and Spelman, around this upcycling piece, especially when it comes down to clothing. And there are multiple students. One was a part of one of our innovation and entrepreneurship center initiatives, where she launched a brand out of upcycling clothes. From the circularity standpoint, this is great because it reduces the amount of items that have to be produced, the items that will be disposed of, and it's also just allowing them to put their personal flair and flavor on things. And this student in particular, she was able to get some of her clothes and some of her the lines that she produced on some celebrities here in Atlanta. And so it was a big following, right? But there's multiple students every year. When we talk about this swap shop, this thrifting, it also creates it creates some levity when it comes down to resources, right? A lot of times if students don't have the same level of resources in college, right, from a justice and an equity standpoint, for us at Morehouse, which is an all-male institution, we have to have suits, we have shoes, we have other things like that that are in place. And I think that it adds a different flavor to the campus, and it actually engages the students. So I'm glad that Tara brought that up. And that's something that I think that as colleges is something that we have to get into. And Elizabeth, you want to say something? Remember we were talking about the end of the school year and those items. What were you?
Oh yeah. And so Shadid and I were talking about like during dorm cleanouts, kids are all leaving and you have a lot of bulky waste furniture, perfectly usable stuff, and what happens to it, and I've heard of many, recycling or campus programs where it's like they try and collect it, put it in like a free center, but that stuff is very bulky and, storage, I'm sure, is at a minimum for many folks. Just that's just the reality. So that's a huge issue. And then too, it's like, so how, what are the solutions for that? But also too, kind of along Tara's going back to Tara's question, there is also understanding where folks are coming from. If you grew up poor, or like socioeconomically disadvantaged, but I grew up poor. That's the word, like everything I had was hand me down or thrifted. And, and so when you get something new, it's like, that's a big deal. And so if you've always had, if that's been your life, versus it's a privilege, to get to go to thrift stores and have fun doing that. There's a difference there, like where it's just part of your life. And sometimes, getting new stuff or getting what you can afford is all you can do. And so there's different perspectives too. And then, as well, kind of into this is bringing it all full circle. Like with textiles, like students can afford fast fashion, which is, garbage clothing you can wear for 4 or 5 times and then it's just unusable. And so there's not a lot of textile options. They can't afford clothes that will last them. So how, what are the systems there that can really help support students? And then, even just the size issue, that's a huge issue in reuse is, having quality clothing for folks who are plus size. There's a project in Seattle called T for T Clothing Swap. It's for trans and non-binary folks who, need larger sizes, where they're so like specifically focused on getting clothing to meet their needs. And so it's, sometimes it's, maybe working with student groups too to help support like finding those things to meet the needs of certain student populations. But then too, like, going back to the bulky waste thing is, how can you, maybe hire students to elevate, those like furniture items at the end of the year to help refurbish them, clean them up, so they are attractive to somebody who comes in at the beginning of the next year who needs those items, to make it desirable for them, to be able to take it and accept it, even, as a reused item, and not feeling like they're getting less than.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I know a lot of colleges and universities run move out programs. They try to collect that stuff. And as you mentioned, space is always an issue, but I think those programs for many, many years was sort of not quite a luxury, but it was sort of a nice add-on if you had it. And now it's transitioning, which is great to see. It's transitioning to more of these basic needs that colleges and universities are recognizing, along with sort of food insecurity. It could be clothing, and whether they're fighting sort of the fast fashion concept, or they realize that people need clothes in a variety of sizes and shapes and wherever, climates. They're starting to allocate some resources to bolster up some of those programs, which is good to see. Slowly, but it is happening, which is nice. Another question came up, getting back to the issue about trust. Somebody posed a question. They said people may have a good reason to mistrust based on past experiences. Can either of you talk about any good strategies to address how we could address some of those concerns?
Would you like to start, Shafid?
Um, I'll start. I think, this goes into a lot of why it's important to inform students and communities around EJ in particular. Just from a personal perspective, and when I think about environmental justice and trust is a major piece. When you have communities that have historically been challenged, right? All the waste and the trash is close to those communities, right? They're looked at as disposable, right? The opposite of sustainability, right? Sustainability is what do we put in place to, we want our community to last a long time. If we feel as though people or communities are treated as disposable, a lot of times we are put in positions where the lack of trust comes in. Just from a personal standpoint, I know Corey's in the New England area. And when we talk EJ, the first thing a lot of us think of is Dr. Robert Bullard and some of the, tremendous environmental justice works that he's done, including the first one in the Carolinas, in Warren County. And me, there's personal stories that I have, right, with my family, right? I have family members who are from that area and that community. So you have communities that there is an inherent lack of trust. The best way to build that, I think, is just kind of putting forth sincere efforts to ensure that the community is informed about the full cycle of what's really going on, right? Right now we're in a huge decarbonization movement. So you have companies, you have organizations where it might seem not as sincere. So I think that it's important to just listen to the community, listen to what they're saying, listen to what their concerns are. I think those are the best ways to build trust within these communities, and I think that would kind of help provide a better platform for people to feel comfortable with this work.
I'm not sure I can add much more to that great answer and response. I mean, I think it is about humility too. And, I encourage folks who don't have that lived experience or haven't, experienced a lot of the harms that especially Black and Brown folks in our communities have faced, to think about, like how you've reacted in other ways, like, for example, as a woman, where you felt like sexism or any other ism against you, and kind of using, figuring out that personal experience to help you frame some humility in approaching this too. And, not coming in, with that paternalistic or white savior, mentality of like, I'm gonna rescue you. I have this great program that's gonna save the world through recycling, which by the way, we know recycling won't save the world. But it's having that humility too, and being authentic, again, back to being authentic, and on top of all the, well, focusing on, what Shadid shared.
Corey, I want to say one more thing about that.
Yeah, please.
I think that it's important for the colleges and universities too to partner with the communities that are most impacted. I think when it comes down to this work, it's pervasive, right? I'm sure that we can all go to different sections of our community, and it goes back to something Elizabeth and I were talking about, which is kind of know the stories and listen to the stories of how these communities formed. But there are ways that, folks who are conscious and well-resourced, even with information, can kind of go out and partner with communities that aren't. We try to do a good job of that in Atlanta. At Morehouse, we work with the other institutions kind of here locally from, Emory, Georgia Tech, Georgia State, as well as the other colleges in the AUC. And we just happen to have a lot of resources here locally, but there's also some regional challenges. So I think that we almost, to be able to communicate with, we can identify future Superfund sites, right? We know where a lot of the, paper mills and recycling centers and, and trucking hubs and, where you're getting, particulate matter and other kind of things that impact communities. I think it's important to just first inform, listen to the stories. And I think that will kind of be able to kind of bring some levity in those spaces.
Yeah, and one thing I would add is, we're all here, this is CURC, right? The College and University Recycling Coalition. And colleges and universities are made up of mainly students. Obviously, there's wonderful staff and faculty too, but we have the ability to leverage these great students, these up-and-coming students from all over the world to embrace some of the service learning. And I think it's a great opportunity that I know that we all try to engage with, but sometimes we might miss that opportunity to connect our campuses with communities and have them identify some of those challenges, work with some of those challenges, whether they're getting internships or doing research for a class or even volunteering their time for a student club. I think it's a great opportunity to bridge those two things. I know it's something we try to do a lot of at the University of Vermont. And sometimes it means more administrative and managerial challenges for folks who don't always have that time, but it's a great opportunity to do that. There's a couple questions coming in. One is, imagine you're a staff member at a public university. The state legislature recently withheld cost of living pay increases to employees unless all public universities made significant cuts to its DEI programs. How would you recommend these staff members go forward within this type of work environment?
That is a tough one. It's asking folks to compromise on what's right, and it's a heartbreaking reality that we have, to live in, unfortunately. And it's easier said than done, but it goes back to finding those allies, really, knowing what your personal stances are, but then also too, like, because we're talking about a workplace, too, that's how you pay your bills, that's how you live, right? And I think a lot of the challenges with equity and justice work in the workplace is, it's like we might feel really strongly about something and care about issues that impact people who, may not have the same identities as us, but it's also tied to your paycheck and how you live. And so it's a huge challenge. And I don't know that there is a strong answer to that, because it's, figuring out yourself, like, what are you willing to take a stand on? And again, also in identifying your allies in this work too. And, hopefully also, understanding that hopefully legislation and these harmful policies can change with elections. But yeah, I'm gonna hand it to you, Shadi. That's a really tough question.
I worked federal government for a lot of years, and one thing I think that we have to, this stuff changes all the time, right? Language, policy, right? We've gone from the language of health disparities to social determinants of health, right? We're addressing things. I think that it's an opportunity to continue to do what you do, right? If you're someone who sits in a space, which I believe I do, I believe in having a more equitable and just society for all, right? So language change, shift, right? If they're saying, okay, they don't want DEI, okay, we're now working on, a balanced community approach, and do the same work, keep the same work going, right? Don't allow the language to stop you from elevating the work. And a lot of times I think it's like a booby trap in a sense, where folks want to throw it in there to say, hey, listen, we're going to box you in. So now you're no longer can talk about this work. Well, you can still do the work, right? And just change the language, right? Just say we're going to, we're working on a sustainable, balanced approach. And I think that that's kind of the direction that we have to keep the work going. When Corey was talking about the students, I want to make sure that we don't forget that's the biggest asset that we have. I have a student, he started a group called Midnight Riot. And what they do is after, homecomings or big things that are going on in the community, at the college community, they'll go out in the external community right next to the college, and they'll get other students and they'll pick up plastics and trash and waste, and they'll clean up water bottles, where you have folks here, we have people sell water off the side of the highway. So they'll do this stuff. So I say just become active and try to implement and be a change, but don't stop doing the work. The legislation will change, the work will stay. So
Yeah.
great question and very complicated.
I will say I say to folks a lot, EDI has become a political issue when it's not, it's a human issue. And folks really struggle with reconciling where they've done wrongdoings in the past. I think it's human nature, right? And so we're unfortunately seeing this, and I see another question about like anti-DEI bills, where folks have, like who lean a certain direction, really feel like, they pucker up in a way, at the idea, because there's this mentality that people feel like they're going to lose out by sharing resources and access and creating equitable systems. But it's a human issue, and sometimes too, when you're working with folks like that, like in your, working with the legislature is a different, story or beast, but in the workplace, is figuring out what, like, along what Shadid said, like figuring out what language folks use, and, like, in my work, I've found, like, especially as I'm working with like a certain group of folks who are really scared about EDI or DEI work, is being able to hold compassion for them, but not coddling them, is what I call it, because it's like we still need to, recognize like the horrible history of this country, but we also need to move forward in an equitable way with everyone moving forward. So it's easier said than done. And I love that Shadid brought up, like, change your language. You can still be doing the same thing with calling it something different.
Yeah. Having the ability to pivot when necessary. I'm going to use the word language to pivot to a question that I think is interesting, because language is so important. A lot of us deal with contracts on campus, and somebody posted a question. Has anyone here, they specifically say on the call, so folks feel free to chat and bring in your resources to the chat. But have either you, Elizabeth, or Shadid, have you ever experience incorporating DEI objectives into contractual relationships with waste haulers, specifically to avoid environmental justice impacts downstream, whether that be incineration, transportation, pollution, et cetera? So anything specific to contracts, I think that's a really important way to operationalize some of these initiatives.
So in Portland, I worked with the city of Portland on creating an equitable waste system. And a lot of, the challenges were understanding what exactly you wanted in the contract. What does it mean to have an environmentally just service provider, or system that you're providing to folks? So being clear on what your expectations are, and also, communicating with your hauler to change that language. And, to, like, city of Portland was able to work in, like, requirements for like staff trainings, and, working on improving like a more diverse workforce, things like that. So not specific language, contract language off the top of my head, but there is some stuff being done there. And I would look at what the city of Portland's doing. And I think you can just Google their waste equity plan.
I'm familiar with folks putting that language in their hauling contracts. Two in particular come to mind here in Atlanta. One is some work that the Atlanta Airport Authority was doing. And it becomes kind of challenging. And we're in the Southeast. And so it's less expensive to dump and put in a landfill than it is to recycle. And so it's also a very little consequence if you don't recycle, which to me, it makes no sense. You're in a space where, a lot of the agriculture-based work is coming, a lot of the food sources coming from around the country. There's space, there's land, there's temperature. To me, it would be mindful for them to kind of look forward to preserving it as much as possible. So I think it's a work in progress. For us in particular at Morehouse, the goal really is to work with some of the mills themselves to see what items can be reused. And then also having some communications with some of the big producers of items. So if we have aluminum, being able to kind of get that stuff back to places like Novelis or other companies that recycle aluminum. Of course, and we're in Coca-Cola country and bottling country and, all these other things. So the goal is to try to get this back to the producer itself. And they have programs kind of set up in place because it helps them reduce costs as well, right? At the end of the day, it's a bottom line driven space. I think that the work that we're doing, it reduces the cost for industry. I think it's very difficult for them to bring those things and justify those things. But I think it's important for us to kind of paint that picture. So I think that was a great question.
Sorry, real quick. Elizabeth, you mentioned this earlier with your slides, but how can equity and justice be operationalized in the recycling field at the collegiate level? Anything about that you can speak to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's again nuance, like understanding who's on your power map, who are your players. Because it's like when you look at it from just a systems perspective of, and there's a question about like diverse suppliers to support waste management. Is understanding like who are you paying to come on campus to help support your systems? Who are you hiring as your staff to come be part of your programs to help educate students? How are you involving the student population? And then operationalizing as far as, to the student populations. Again, it's, understanding what the students' needs are and figuring out, like, for example, there's a question about tips to increase recycling accessibility for students with disabilities. Like, if you're familiar with the term targeted universalism, where you are focusing on meeting the needs of the person who's most impacted or has the most need, then you can also benefit other folks along the way. So, for example, with ramps, when you're going into a public space, like if you have a ramp, like it absolutely benefits a wheelchair user, but it also benefits, someone who might have hurt their back and can't go up the stairs or have problems with their knees, or a mom with or parent with a stroller. So it has all those like unintended benefits that go along with it, and so it's thinking about how are you meeting the needs of the folks who are most impacted. So student with disability, like whatever the disability is, like maybe it's somebody with blindness, like, do you need to have materials either read to them or have Braille available? So it's thinking about that. And then two, there's no one size fits all approach. I think that's a lot of the challenge is our time and budgets are so limited that sometimes that's all we have capacity to do. But it's like understanding how to figure out enough budget to have, to have tools to reach folks, at different layers and levels.
Yeah, wonderful. It's two wonderful terms I've learned here today in this webinar is targeted universalism, which I had not heard that term before, and transcreation, which we were briefly discussing before, but I actually hadn't heard that term until I attended a different webinar just recently. But you put a nice name to that term. And for folks who aren't familiar with transcreation, basically a lot of times if we're designing marketing and promotional recycling material, and I've been very guilty of this, is just simply translating the English into some other language without really doing the necessary steps to translate it correctly, add potentially different symbols, potentially target different products that different communities may be using. And so that's what I understand to be transcreation, which I think is accurate. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And also I see somebody, James put in the chat, the universal design principles, which is wonderful. That's something I actually just took a class in that over this past summer, specifically for course creation on a faculty perspective. But I think it applies generally, specifically to recycling programs. So thank you, James, for putting that in there. I think that's a wonderful resource for people to check out as well. So I want to encourage folks, we have 5 minutes left. I want to encourage folks to either put a chat in the Q&A or put a chat in the chat box. But I would just want to give you each, a couple more minutes if you want to have any sort of closing remarks or takeaways from this. I'd love to open it up for that. And we'll start with Elizabeth.
Well, thank you all for attending this and, just showing that this is important to you, and it's not an easy journey. Don't lose hope or faith. Keep at it. And it can be exhausting to have these conversations. Sometimes when I'm having to have like deep equity and justice conversations in the waste industry, I will need about 4 hours to recover because it can be mentally draining. So giving yourself space and also giving yourself grace as you're doing this. And, there's no perfect system. We're all learning this together. We're working towards an equitable future for everyone, but also to get that equitable future, we also have to address the past harms and, figure out how to get folks to, the tools and systems that they need to be able to make it equitable. So be patient and, give yourself grace, give yourself some breathing space too in this work. It's not easy, and find your allies in this work. Don't go at it alone.
Thank you. Shadid?
Elizabeth hit every single thing in her statement there. I just would just second that, right? Work collectively and, try to, engage and be sincere in the work, and the help will come. So, I'm excited to see what we can do in the future collectively. And I know that we can have an impact, especially on our communities around us, just by listening. And, Elizabeth, it still resonates with me, the story you told me about, I've never been out to Pacific Northwest when you told me about some of the communities and how they were displaced, and also the impact that has had on the recycling story, right, in those areas. So I think that it's important to listen and see how a lot of these communities have formed. See how a lot of the behaviors have formed, and seeing how we can impact the community really by listening first, and then helping them in ways that can build for more equitable and just space for all.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you both. And again, for folks joining us, feel free to drop any resources in the chat. There's some great links in there, so be sure and collect those. Elizabeth, I believe you have shared your email, but if anybody's interested in getting those worksheets from her, this will be recorded, or I should say it is being recorded, and will be available on our website. And please feel free to contact Elizabeth directly. Is that okay for people to do that? For those worksheets as well. Before we go, I am just going to share, if I can do this really quick here. I'm going to share my screen, if I can even find my where I am at here. There we go. Just want to give folks a heads up about what's coming up for CURC in the future. People can see that. Too many clicks here, too many open pages. Okay, so can everybody see that? Some upcoming events. We have our annual members meeting on the 18th in the new year of January. So after everyone gets through the holidays, we'll be excited to get everyone together to have our members meeting on the 18th at 2 p.m. Please go to our website, curc3r.org, for today's webinar, which won't be up right away, but eventually it will be up. Of course, past webinar recordings and slides can be found there as well. We have already got our first webinar of 2024 in the books. That's going to be on February the 22nd. We're going to be talking about leveraging federal funding for campus sustainability and waste reduction. As folks probably know, there's the Build Back Better program, and there's I forget the other acronym that's out there right now, but there's a lot of money available at the federal level for doing some of this work. So we're going to talk about that at that one. That's again Thursday, February the 22nd. And we also have a submission process for proposing webinars. So if anybody out there is interested, please go to our website, curc3r.org, and submit a proposal. If you're interested in a topic or want to present, we'd love to hear from you. I also want to thank Leah separately of CURC, who's doing the back end work on this today. Thank you, Leah. And again, thank you to Elizabeth and Shadid for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. I think that turned out great.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate the time. And I'm looking forward to keeping in touch. And hopefully, I was even thinking if you'd be willing to, maybe we can do something in the spring again, the part 2 of this. It's great. Again, it's a great topic. And I think the cool thing about it is that it touches on the great thing. I always say recycling is the gateway to sustainability. Sustainability is transitioning into circularity, and it touches on all these different topics. So I think there's really a lot of angles we can attack this from. So it's pretty
Yeah,
good.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Talk to you soon. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you, Leah. Appreciate it. See ya.